TimeBank believes in a banking future with more for every entrepreneur. Start paying less and getting more. With TimeBank, you've got this.
Welcome to Small Business Evolution. I am Nontobeko Gumede. According to the Experian Business Debt Index, also known as BDI, South Africa's SMEs have shown strong resilience between the last quarter of 2022 and the first quarter of 2023. BDI helps to measure the overall health of a business, reflecting on the relative ability for businesses to pay their outstanding suppliers and creditors. Joining me in studio today is the Experian's Head of Strategy and Innovation, Jaco van Jaarsveld, to discuss the findings from the index itself and what it really means for SMEs. Jaco, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Jaco, you know, a lot of media outlets have been reporting a lot of doom and gloom when it comes to economy, and a lot of experts have sort of like predicted some form of substantial economic decline due to the significant intensification of load shedding. But it seems like the reports and the actual stats are reporting otherwise. So can you please just share some of the insights gathered by the BDI?
Sure. The Experian Business Debt Index, as you said, measures the relative ability of small and medium businesses to pay their suppliers and their creditors, and we measure it on a quarterly basis. Now, there's two components that contribute to the measure, and that is number one, the macro environment, which looks at the South African and the US GDP, and we know that both the US and the South African GDP in quarter one and quarter two, in fact, of 2023 has been better than expected. In fact, if you look at the Q2 numbers, they've actually grown substantially relative to the Q1 numbers. So the macro environment actually outperformed expectation, which as contributors into small business performance is a positive. On the negative side, however, is if you look at the explicit performance of small businesses and you go start looking at their debtors age ratios, and we measure two specific debt age ratios. We measure 30 to 60 day debtors relative to your earlier debt, so your less than 30 day debt, and then also your 60 to 90 day debtors age ratio. And we've seen deterioration in both those components, which, whilst the economy at a macro level outperformed expectation, we can already see a more pressure on the small and medium enterprises in the South African economy as we see longer term debt stress starting to come to the fore from a debt servicing perspective.
And I'm guessing that's where the SME debt stress ratio comes in. But what can be done to decrease that?
So I think economic growth is fundamentally important, and we know that the macro environment outperformed on the basis of better than expected load shedding, etc. Now, from a business perspective, we also know that as a result of that, there's still been demand, and there's still been demand for services, etc. And therefore, from a small business perspective, whilst it's still resilient, there's still a level of resilience in the small business and medium business industries. And from a business perspective, consumers are more and more in distress. And that's where we see the distress come through from a small business perspective. We've seen consumer demand drop, and as consumers become under more pressure, demand drops on a small business front, etc. And that's where we see that stress come from. So small businesses are dependent on consumers, unfortunately. And as consumers are in distress, we see that start flowing through into the SME world as well.
Now, as the head of strategy and innovation, what does the organization do with all of this information and all of its data? How do you use all of this to offer a service offering to the public?
So it's important for us to consider both consumer and small business, especially when you start looking at micro enterprises and small businesses, because there's a very close correlation, a gray area between those two segments, because effectively the consumer is also the small and micro enterprise owner. And thus, if you look at the performance of those two sectors, we need to say, right, number one, there's the stress in the market, but the distress in the market that we see from a consumer perspective, who's also the small business owner, is on two fronts. What we need to do, and what we do as an organization, we say, well, we can't only expect the market that's currently delivering services and the demand side of the economy to continue growing. And thus we need to consider what's happening to the credit excluded or the new entry market, new to credit market on the consumer front and on the youth side, number one, and also look at that segment and say, how does that segment become big players in the small and micro enterprise industries? And what we're doing as a business, we're saying, right, step one is we need to create financial habits that's healthy in that segment. And what we do is we provide direct-to-consumer services and a direct-to-consumer progressive web application where we actually provide education to consumers and small businesses alike in managing your business and managing your consumer finances effectively, and budgeting, the importance of budgeting, and then also instilling behaviors that focuses on saving and investment, and using that data that we collect through this process, through an engagement with a small business or with a consumer, which, as I said, is very closely correlated, using that to the benefit and the power of that small business and consumer by using that data to create alternative data mechanisms or risk tools or risk assessment models that we can then use to either supplement existing traditional mechanisms or create new mechanisms to create a more inclusive financial economy for all South Africans and small businesses, thus supporting growth in the economy.
Well, thank you very much, Jaco. I feel like there's still so much more to unpack. For instance, how SMEs can create those healthy habits, but we will have you back again. Thank you very much for joining us. That was Experian's Head of Strategy and Innovation, Jaco van Jaarsveld, joining us to discuss the findings from the Experian Business Debt Index and its implications for SMEs.
TimeBank believes in a banking future with more for every entrepreneur. Start paying less and getting more. With TimeBank, you've got this.